Today, we're going to be speaking with Heath Druzin, who's creator and host of the podcast Extremely American, produced in partnership with Post-Industrial Media and Boise State Public Radio. You can find Extremely American everywhere you get podcasts. Heath, it's really great having you on today. I appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So, certainly since the Trump riots and even before that, we've been covering militia groups, so-called militia groups, for a long period of time. You covered the Pennsylvania volunteer militia, which is sort of adjacent to some of the other groups maybe people in my audience are familiar with. Can you talk a little bit about how'd you get interested in this? How'd you start covering them? What are some of their views? How would we characterize these groups?
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering the militia movement and kind of the broader far right movement for a number of years now. What kind of got me started on this podcast is I started seeing them get a lot more politically active, kind of come out of the woods, come out of the mountains, and be much more visible in everyday life. The Pennsylvania Volunteers, they are an interesting group because they're led by a guy named Christian Yingling. And he played a pretty notable role in Charlottesville in 2017. And your listeners probably recognize that. That was the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville that also drew in a lot of militia groups who said they were there to basically keep the peace between right-wing protesters and left-wing counter-protesters. Some people question that. So Yingling was there. He actually got sued and agreed to never come back to Charlottesville with a militia. So he's been in the news. He's a very sort of colorful character. So I got to know him through that. And I had been doing a number of interviews with him and trying to get in on his training because I wanted to give listeners of my podcast, Extremely American, I wanted to give them a real feel for what it's like to be at a training with a militia, what they do, get there on the gun range with them. So that's what brought me out there. It took me a while to get their trust, but they eventually let me come to their monthly training, which was deep in the Pennsylvania woods, kind of out in these rolling mountains in Western Pennsylvania, the sort of classic site you would imagine a militia training happening at.
Yeah.
So that's what got me there.
And, we've spoken to people who have, I don't want to use the term infiltrated, but who have been sort of like granted access to different types of extremists, and different journalists and reporters take different approaches in terms of whether they just remain extraordinarily neutral in terms of their opinion of what it is that they're observing, or whether they are sort of engaged in conversations about their views as to what these groups do. What's the dynamic like when you're with these folks in terms of how they see you and sort of what the conversations are like?
Yeah, I mean, so if you listen to the podcast, especially episode 1 with this group, what you'll hear is I let them tell their own story. But, I don't just sit on the sidelines. If somebody says something outlandish, I challenge them.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. Christian Yingling, at one point, he's talking about he went to a Trump rally where there were counter protesters, and he was standing with his guys between the left and right wing protesters. Well, he talks about the story about how he was basically trying to get the left wing protesters to back up. Now, they're in a public park, right? He has no authority there. He's a private citizen. And he's telling them to back up, and he's telling them basically, if you don't back up, I'm going to break your leg to one of the guys. And that's where I do step in, and I'm like, well, now hold on, under whose authority do you do that? And so there's back and forths like that. I do want to let them tell their own story because I think that's more interesting for a listener than me just spouting off. But certainly, I'm not going to let something like that just sort of twist in the wind. So there's some kind of fun back and forth about that. About January 6th, about Donald Trump. So yeah, I'll challenge people when I feel like that is appropriate. But I do also want people to hear their viewpoint, because I think understanding these groups is much more important than slamming them, for example, just to sort of feel good.
At the individual level, I've spoken to a lot of former hate group members, including KKK and some other groups. And the one theme that is present in all of their stories was they were sucked in because of a sort of personal vulnerability of their situation that came often from sort of like the prototypical absent or broken family, or lack of direction from parents. It's like a very similar story that they all tell. Is that a common backstory in the folks that you see in the militia groups, or is that different?
So I would say there's a little bit of yes and no there. I've certainly met people who fit that mold. I think with militia groups, though, because most of them they're not explicitly racist, and a lot of them actually will at least outwardly reject that.
Mm.
I think they have a bit of broader appeal. I think when you're talking about like explicitly white supremacist groups, I think that recruitment's a little tougher, and you really have to try harder. With the militia groups, they try to have a bigger tent, I guess you can say. So what I do find, though, is people who are very disaffected with what's happening in America. They might be uncomfortable with a changing country. They might be uncomfortable with increasing diversity. They may not say it like that, but they will talk about certain things like transgender rights come up a lot, and that makes a lot of people in this movement uncomfortable. They'll talk about critical race theory. Now, whether or not that's actually a real thing in American schools, that's obviously something that people are debating. But there is a discomfort with a changing America that draws people in. And I think certainly Donald Trump's rise to power and some of the things he said made them feel more empowered than they have, and I think made them feel more comfortable coming out in the open as opposed to just training out in the woods.
Is there a notable undertone of anti-Semitism in these groups?
I would actually say no. I am a Jewish reporter. I did not feel that directly. I did speak to one very prominent Jewish member of the 3% militia in Washington State. He figures prominently in episode 3, and we talk a little bit about his background. Now, is that to say that there is not a strain of anti-Semitism? No. I also ran into some really offensive stuff where people would they would compare COVID protocols to Nazism. Now, is that directly anti-Semitism? We can debate that, but it's certainly
Right.
very offensive, I think, to a lot of people. So I would say explicitly, no. You do get that undercurrent with some people, and I think you do get some sort of explaining away of stuff.
How prominent is the presence of law enforcement, current or former, and military, current and former, in your experience in these groups?
I run into a lot of ex-military in these groups.
Hmm.
I also run into a lot of people who kind of are in the, I wish I would have served kind of mold. But you do run into a lot of veterans. You run into some law enforcement. It gets kind of murky. There's certainly some law enforcement that have been supportive. There's a whole sheriff's movement called the Constitutional Sheriff's Movement, and they have elected sheriffs all over the country. Joe Arpaio in Arizona was part of that, and they're very friendly to militias. Now, you also get law enforcement who are dead set against them because they see their anti-government rhetoric as also anti-law enforcement. So it's a very mixed bag. But I would say the veteran part of it, that is a robust part of the the militia movement.
Do the militia groups get along with each other, or do they see each other as competitors, or they believe they aren't, do they have problems with the ideologies of some of the other groups?
So that's a great question. This might not be surprising, but anti-government movements are not very good at centralized control. So there is a lot of bickering back and forth and a lot of infighting. And frankly, just some honest disagreements where you'll have groups that absolutely will disavow another group, including different 3% groups. There's a group in Georgia that has a Confederate flag in their logo, and some of the other 3%ers in the West, they'll look to them and say, we absolutely want nothing to do with those guys. They're racist and we reject them. So it's a mixed bag. They do come together over two things: a radical view of limited government and pretty much absolutist gun rights. Any restriction on gun rights they see as a red line. I would say almost every militia group agrees on those two things.
What is or let's see how I can phrase this. There's the fear among observers of some of these groups that at some point they're going to do like their big thing, like the you think about Jim Jones and Jonestown, and eventually there was like the mass suicide of the 950 people in South America, and it was sort of like the culmination of the entire thing. And there's the fear that some equivalent, not killing themselves necessarily, but there's the equivalent that they're building to some kind of big event. Do you get the sense that that's the eventual goal, or are they there more of as like as a constant low grade protection again, as they see it, against the tyranny and oppression of the government or whatever the case may be, without planning like some big event?
I think what you're seeing is, and what I get into in Extremely American, is this shift away from that kind of thinking more to, hey, we have this moment where we've got more mainstream support. Let's try to change government from the inside. There's a lot of younger leaders who I would say are much more politically savvy than the old guard from the Michigan Militia and those kind of groups. And, they're targeting their local school boards, their library boards. They're picking off state Senate and state legislature seats. So that's not to say we couldn't have that. I mean, we've seen it at least twice. We saw Cliven Bundy's ranch where all those militia guys were pointing weapons at federal agents. Right. That could have gone quickly. And we saw it in Oregon where Ammon Bundy, Cliven's son, had an armed standoff of his own. Now, we could totally see that again. I think a lot of these guys are much more focused on trying to bring government to the right as opposed to, having an armed confrontation, even though when you ask them, they will admit they are simultaneously training to fight against the government and kind of trying to be a part of it.
Yeah, well, so that was going to be my next thing, which is you talked about the presence of military veterans. There's in hypothetical discussions about what might happen if one of these groups really tried something big, there's the reality that eventually they might be confronting not just police, but if they really wreaked enough havoc, the National Guard, or they would sort of be against the military, but they are made up. They have a significant former military presence. How do they conceive of that, of the idea that ultimately the force that might stop them is the one that many of them were once a part of?
Right. And that's something you can't escape. When I talk to militia members and leaders about that, often they kind of deflect at first. But when I press them, they admit, yes, I mean, that you can't talk about fighting the government without the possibility and really the almost probability, if you fight the government, that your guns are going to be pointed at law enforcement and or troops. Now, what they'll say if you press them is that, righteous troops and law enforcement will step aside because the battle will be righteous for the militia guys. Right. But it's absolutely something that hangs in the background and you can't avoid it. And when you look at those standoffs, they were against law enforcement and they weren't against troops, but they were against law enforcement. And in the case of the Oregon standoff, there was a deadly shootout and a man got killed. So it's not theoretical. That could happen, and it has happened.
In terms of the political alignment, when it comes to Democrats, Republicans, et cetera, I mean, you made it clear they want to move the government to the right. Their most important issues certainly align more with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. But is there any political diversity within these groups?
Yeah, and I also get into that in the podcast because I think the political angle on these groups, it makes them so much more interesting now. I mean, I should say yes and no. Are any of them Democrats that I've met? No. Do they have diverse political views? Yeah. There is a diversity of views. Some are more libertarian, sort of live and let live. Some of them are really much more sort of fundamentalist far right groups. And I would say more of them are of that ilk. And that's why they're targeting school boards. They talk a lot about critical race theory and culture war issues. And I think that's a big change from the 1990s. In the 1990s, they might have been very conservative, but they were very much pox on both parties. They're all the same. These guys today, they're much more involved in Republican politics. And I think that's a really important shift because they've sort of picked sides in a way that they didn't in the past. They just saw all government as bad before.
Right. That's interesting. And there's also the question as to how responsible Donald Trump is for that, and whether the political activism may fade to some degree if Trumpism fades. I mean, that's a question we've had about the general voter who never voted before Trump, was pulled in to vote for Trump. And then now it's unclear how engaged they stay, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the one of the biggest questions hanging over this movement. Now, I think they were on the rise before Trump. I saw them rising before Trump, but they were supercharged by Trump. They saw somebody at the highest echelon of power. Really, they saw him as supportive. Now, they talk a lot about basically taking that momentum and continuing that kind of Trumpism without Trump. I think we're going to see. I think that's a real open question. I think these midterm elections might have a lot to do with it. But they're trying to keep that momentum up right now. And I do think we'll see if Trump jumps back in 2024. But without him, they do potentially lose momentum. But I guess we'll just have to see how far right the right wing of American politics has gone.
Without a doubt, yeah, no, it's without a doubt an open question that we're all sort of anxiously waiting to start getting some answers to. The podcast is Extremely American. Creator and host of the podcast, Heath Druzin, has been talking to us about his investigative work. Heath, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me on.